Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Ashley Barlow Company podcast. I'm Ashley Barlow, your host. If you are a parent, a teacher, or someone who works at a school, or you're a community member, a volunteer, or a staff member at an organization that supports people with special education plans, a coach, a tutor, or even a grandparent, you're in the right place. Sit back with an ice-cold glass of lemonade, put on your walking shoes and grab some headphones, roll down the windows and cruise. Ready, set, go. Educate, advocate, collaborate.
Hi, Taylor. Hi. So excited to be back. Oh, I'm so excited that you're back too. I feel like in the amount of time that it has taken since you were here last, that you and I have become besties, and that makes me very happy. I agree. We have so much fun and love putting our brains together. So it's fun to be able to formalize it and do it in this way. And then you're coming back on my podcast too. And yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. And nothing makes me more excited from a business standpoint than when I get like a voice memo from one of my colleagues, and I get a lot of them from you, and I am able to send you a lot. Because what I know is that we're about to pick each other's brains, and that we, kind of start at this like baseline level of information, and we can trust one another, and we can be vulnerable, but we can really like kind of get to the heart of a matter and help each other's clients. And I so appreciate when you send me that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's so helpful, but I think it is like as professionals, we have to know where our limits are, and a lot of times I will be asked to join IEP teams, for families that I'm working with as a psychologist. And I always say I have enough information to be lethal, but I don't have all the information. And so when it starts to get complicated, that's where I'm like, okay, what are some next steps here? And unfortunately, we've had a few conversations about families recently where the concept of due process has come up as a possibility in this, and I know that's not the goal, but that shows sometimes when we're getting there for a reason.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes we have to go to due process, and I'm always happy to help you on today, let you pick my brain. And that's what we're going to be doing here today, because we're going to be talking about PDA. And despite what we learned in middle school, we are not talking about public displays of affection. You and I could do a whole podcast on the PDA, public displays of affection, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, if people want to hear that sometime.
Yeah, for real. Oh my gosh, that would be so much fun.
We could do a podcast called PDA or PDA, and we could pull up pictures.
Oh, that'd be great.
Okay, it would be so dumb, and only we would be entertained. But before we talk about demand avoidance, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, what you care about the disability community, and about your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a licensed psychologist, and I specialize in working with autistic children and their families. I do diagnostic evaluations for autism, as well as providing therapeutic support. And I started my practice, Dr. Tay Concierge Clinical Care, a little over 2 years ago, where I realized that, there are services out there for autism, and they're great. There are crazy wait lists. We know that. But then also I realized that there were some gaps in the way services were being provided that I didn't love. And I was like, but wait, we can do this different, right? We don't have to accept the status quo. And so then it was all about designing a business that, not only helps and serves families, but also, myself, and as I've grown my team with other clinicians and team members that are also serving us, because when we are served and our mental health is good, that allows us to help families even more. And so, it's been this journey of building this practice, and it's been so much fun. I recently added two psychologists to the practice as well. And we just are super passionate about providing neurodiversity affirming care for autistic children and their families. And the families is key because I was raised with an autistic brother. We're 10 years apart. I was 12 when he was diagnosed, and I saw the little support that my parents got in navigating the autism diagnosis in terms of their own needs and their own processing. My brother got lots of support, but then in turn, helping me as a kid understand this too. And so I love being able, to support the whole family. And it's definitely, we use what is called the whole family approach to make sure everyone in the family is being served on this autism journey.
That's another topic that we should do at some point. We should talk about that whole family approach and why, even basic stuff that like why consistency is so important, but also why the relationships between parents and other siblings, parents and autistic or other disabled child are important and like partner relationships and all that kind of stuff in self-care. And yeah, that's super important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we can do things differently. And so that's trying to pave the way to do that. I also think as well, like this whole idea of PDA, what we're talking about today is we're hearing a lot about it on social media, but we're not getting a lot of providers who are, taking the time to learn about it and shift their approaches, and it puts families between a rock and a hard place. And what happens is then parents end up having to be this advocate, and saying like, listen to me. And then providers are going, well, this isn't a real thing. And I think that there absolutely can be a middle ground. No, PDA, and we're going to talk about it, isn't a like official diagnosis, but we also can validate that lived experience and, provide supports and empower parents as experts of their children.
Yeah. And, that's so, so important. So why don't we start with what PDA is? What is the definition? Definition. Like, why don't you describe for us what PDA is and maybe like what the things we're kind of looking for when we're starting to think that maybe our child is experiencing PDA?
Yeah. So PDA technically stands for pathological demand avoidance. But there's been a shift in language, I think, again, as neurodiversity affirming practices come into play, of focusing on, listening to the autistic community, and they really prefer pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent drive for autonomy. And I think, honestly, it's interesting because we want to, in some ways, validate the hardships that come with PDA, and the demand avoidance that is happening, but then also understanding like what really is driving it. And so, what it ultimately is the nervous system and the body is going into this fight or flight mode in response to everyday demands or like a perceived loss of autonomy or equality, or like a lack of control. And while it can present as like very controlling behavior, a lot of defiance, a lot of no, a lot of I'm not doing that, let me find my way out of it. What we, really think about is it's not this child saying they won't do something, but rather they can't. Their nervous system is so dysregulated that they're not able to access, being able to do these things that maybe seem so simple. But what I would like to kind of pause for a moment and help parents to understand is think of some of those moments that are really scary. Your body has gone into fight or flight mode. Imagine experiencing that time and time again every single day. That's not a comfortable feeling. And so I think that can also really help us understand where this dysregulation is coming from and why the child is having a hard time and supporting that. And so it's complicated because it's not this like really well-defined thing. It's right now it's considered a theorized profile of autism, meaning like we're thinking it's a thing. We need a lot more research, but then we also will see overlaps with, other diagnoses like ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, anxiety. I operate right now from the lens of usually when we see PDA, it's, not always. Sometimes it's just, yep, that person's autistic. It's very clear. But a lot of times there's this high masking autism profile. or high masking autism presentation that we missed the autism as part of the diagnosis.
So that I think that's super interesting. And I wonder if anybody researching like cortisol levels with demand, because wouldn't that tell us about fight or flight? Like I'm thinking, I've got adrenal fatigue and I'll connect the stuff myself. And I have been advised to not do hot yoga, for example, because my body will be like, what demand's wrong? And then I will like either have a panic attack or just insane fatigue, whatever my body decides, because it'll go into fight or flight when it starts hot yoga. I'm actually going to retest it because hot yoga and I did not agree, but I also have an intense need to detox. Anyway, that's beside the point. That's been explained to me as cortisol. I wonder what demand does to cortisol.
I don't know this answer. Like, one, I don't know if it's been studied, but two, I would guess probably not, because we're even bringing PDA into the literature has been really slow. There are studies, don't get me wrong, but they're usually very small studies too, right? And they're not very robust. And, there's some sampling bias that comes into play. And this is what some of the critique of, when we're thinking about PDA, we've seen the like more critical side talk about like we just don't know enough. And I think it's one of the things, and I can understand this, that's making providers hesitant to like really jump into this is it's like I was trained in a very evidence-based approach. Like my PhD program, like it was always like, where's the research? Where's the literature? And so it's been interesting navigating this space where we don't have a lot of information yet, but I choose to show up at the like humanistic level and like believe that this is what's going on. Even if I don't have the research. But so that was a little long-winded tangent, but I'd be surprised if they've looked at that. But I also think it's so fascinating because my cortisol levels are also very high, chronically and all of that. And so I've seen the impact it's had on my health by, basically trying to balance some of the imbalances in my body and system and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, we should die a bit together. We'll just make our houses really high. You can stay where you are, I'll stay where I am, and we'll crank up the heat or something. Okay, so another follow-up to your awesome description of PDA is one of my favorite things that I see in my practice that I have just found so intriguing, and I've kind of gone down rabbit holes on this before, is so I have a lot of people in my practice who are like, let's say teenagers, teenage boys, and they start to have behaviors around like the onset of puberty. And so a lot of times they'll go out and they'll go to a wilderness program, and at the end of the wilderness program, they'll get diagnosed and they'll get a full neuropsychological evaluation, and lo and behold, oh my gosh, they're autistic. We missed it. And most of those reports come back and say that these children experience a very unique sense of injustice. Like their justice system is really weird. And I always think about like kids in my classes that I taught or kids in my kids' classes when I would go volunteer. And, like the Valentine's Day relay race would not go their way. And it was like the end of the world. And people would try to breathe reason into them and be like, buddy, it's come to tail on the donkey. It's not that big of a deal. And they just couldn't get it. And I'm like, aha, that's maybe what that was. And, a lot of cases I knew that that's ultimately what it was. I think that's so interesting with the loss of autonomy, right? Like the loss of control and how those things are tied together. I wonder if you could talk about kind of that like justice system and PDA. That's something that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think here's the thing that is complicated is the autistic brain in general sometimes can have these set of rules that maybe don't go in alignment with neurotypical standards and rules that like society sets. And so Well, it could be the PDA profile at play. It also could just be part of autism. And this is where it does get really murky of like, is this PDA or is this autism? I still come from the mindset of just real quick. I find learning about PDA to be helpful for a few reasons. One, it gets a lot of kids evaluated for autism that have never either been evaluated before or were evaluated, were told, no, this isn't autism, but then are still really struggling and nothing seems to be the right explanation. But two, that our approaches of how we go about this, they're really affirming approaches and really supportive approaches. And so this is where I like to bring this conceptualization in. And I don't spend a lot of time of being like, driving myself nuts of like, is this just an autistic trait? Is this PDA? But what I would say, because we can see demand avoidance as well in autistic, individuals, in anyone, truthfully, it's when it rises to that level that I think it's having a lot of impact. And so, well, this like the Valentine's Day relay race, example, that could be there was an unexpected change that's occurring. It could be a sense of fairness of like, well, it was supposed to be my turn, or like an expectation that was there and that wasn't actually what was going to happen, and that shift or a change, all of that can come into play. What I would say PDA really becomes is when we're seeing it like seriously interfere over and over again. And I think that is where we can kind of go to like, is there this strong sense of equality, autonomy, justice? One thing as an example, that will happen quite a lot is there is this rule, and parents will go, well, why do they apply the rule to their siblings, but not to them? And it's like, because of this idea.
Perception.
Right. Yeah, and perception, right? If they make the autonomous decision to break the rule versus their siblings doing it, like they're like, no, but that's the rule. And so it regulates their nervous system to break the rule sometimes, but dysregulates their nervous system when their sibling breaks the rule.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna take that a step further. And then we're gonna back up on this for a second. But my follow-up to that as a parent is, if Jack's breaking a rule to be autonomous, he knows that it's a rule. It might even be a rule that he's created. And Jack does not have autism. He has Down syndrome, if you're a new listener. So if Jack breaks a rule, my sense is oftentimes that he's doing that to find the boundary, to find if that's okay. So, you don't go outside when it's dark alone, right? Like he was going outside at 4 a.m. Can't go outside when it's dark alone. And he might do that when it's like dusky dark, just to see where the boundary is. So I feel like I am helping him when I then offer a consistent consequence for going outside. But should I be giving him more autonomy to help set that rule, or to help enforce the rule, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where it becomes really tricky, and it's hard to give a hard and fast rule here. But what I always like to orient parents to is I like to think about things in buckets. And this goes to a lot of like how we're deciding what demands we're going to drop, or also what I like to say, like where we're going to give autonomy and agency. So a lot of times with PDA, you'll hear low demand parenting. And while I think there's a lot of misinformation around low demand parenting that we see on social media, I also like to reframe it as high autonomy, high agency parenting. But this is where we want to have those different buckets. And this is like just learning about it, like an analogy I came up with. So in one bucket, you have what are called the non-negotiables. These are things you're always going to set boundaries, have demands around that you're mindfully choosing as a parent. Safety related things always go here. And also I say like high family values, things that like are so important to your family that you need these rules and boundaries around. To me, going outside in the dark probably falls under a safety related thing, right? So that would be a non-negotiable where we would set very clear boundaries. We're intentionally choosing the demands. On the other kind of extreme side, opposite of the non-negotiables, I have what are called the shoulds. These are often things that come from one of two places. One, neurotypical parenting standards, where it's just like you just hear it automatically. And it's like, oh, yeah, we should be doing that. But you don't have a neurotypical child. And so you need to ask yourself, like, do you really care about that, or is it your default mechanism? The other place I find that these shoulds often come from is how, as a child, like that the parent themselves were raised. And so, right, like it becomes automatic of like, well, that's what I do as a parent because that's what I saw modeled. And we can very mindfully override that. And I see a lot of parents do this where they're like, yeah, how I was raised is not how I want to parent. So the shoulds are there, but these shoulds are things that we often will drop the demands for because we realize that, it doesn't feel worth the battle. It doesn't feel worth the potential nervous system activation. And then in the middle are what I call the ideals, or I'll sometimes call it the yet bucket, where we're not there yet. It doesn't mean we can't work towards setting those boundaries and having those demands, but we're just not there yet. And some of that is for, these PDAers in particular, they might be an autistic burnout where they have very, very little capacity. And so we do have to reduce a lot of the demands. Some of it might be a skill set that we're not there yet for, but that we're working up towards. And some of it might be because we're intentionally taking a step back to rebuild that relationship and that connection and give that sense of safety before we're adding in a bunch of boundaries and rules. And so I like to have parents go through this exercise themselves of figuring this out. I never, as a provider, will tell you, of course you should be doing it this way, or no, you shouldn't, because I'm not living in your family. This is where we have to think about not only what is in the best interest of the child, but what's also in the best interest of the entire family unit.
Gosh, that's one of the best things I've ever heard in my entire life. I mean, I'm not kidding. Like, that is, I guess that's how I do it. And you just described it. So much room for improvement, though, on my own behalf. And like, I just think that's so good. Like, to me, I heard so much about my values and our family values and the values and interests of everybody else in our family. And I mean, that's so respectful. When I was a divorce attorney, I used to talk about like kind of letting the stuff go that your former spouse would do. And I would say, okay, so there's some things that have to be done. Like when your kids get in the car, then they have to be in a car seat or a seatbelt. Like you've never once been like, we'll give you a treat. You don't have to wear your seatbelt. And so like taking antibiotics, for example, some of them people fight that out all the time. He didn't give them their antibiotic. Okay, I think that's something that you can talk to your former spouse about. But like potty training, is it absolutely important today, right now? Might be because you might have to go to daycare, for an typical kid or something like that. But anyway, I was thinking about that decision making that I used to counsel people on, and then translating that to somebody that's neurodiverse. And Taylor, I think that's brilliant. That's really great.
Thanks for words. Yeah, it was like one of those things that I was taking in a lot of information, and I love analogies. And so having a way to explain this to families. And one of the things that I hear about low demand parenting is like it just feels like you're willy-nillying it, like you're dropping all these boundaries. And it's not actually supposed to be a reactive process, but it's like what we call like the false drop of like, there's not a mindful decision there. It's just like in the moment you're responding. And what a framework like this allows you to do is proactively think about like, where are these things falling? And then that way you can be more consistent. I also think it's really important that like if you have like a parenting partner in this, like that you're talking with that. And that might be your spouse, but it also might be a grandparent, for example.
A babysitter.
Yeah. It's like getting on the same page, I think, is so important. And just to give a quick example too, like I loved some of your examples, right? Like buckling, that's a non-negotiable. That is the one thing, anything around safety, I will say goes in that non-negotiable bucket.
When I play, you know what this mom said? I say no for safety and respect.
Yep.
Now I can do I really care that Jack rips the pages out of a book? Maybe not as much because there's a sensory piece to that and we have 10 bajillion books. But he knows what the special books are, right? And so I would get really upset about a special book, and I have before. So yes, okay, keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I think something like sitting down as a family for dinner, this is one I hear come up quite a lot. And it's really interesting because we don't realize how inherently this is driven by neurotypical parenting standards and also probably how you were raised as a child as well. And so this is one, pediatricians will ask, like, do you sit down together as a family for dinner? And so then it's also like you feel like you should be doing that. And what they really are intending to ask is like, are you spending quality time together as a family? But for some families, then this is where talking about this exercise, I've had parents be like, you know what? We literally don't care. My kid can go sit on the couch and eat their meal as long as they're able to access their safe foods, they're nourished. It might even be less stressful for us because, that's my time. I had a mom say this for my husband and I to be able to catch up and like, he's regulated, we're good. Like, we're going to drop that demand and we're totally fine with that. I had another family, for example, that was like, no, this is important to us, right? Like, this is something we really want to do. And so then we looked, it was this consideration of accommodating the autistic child sitting there. And so this autistic child would sit at the dinner table with the rest of the family. What's really interesting, which could be a whole other kind of topic itself, in order to access eating, the one way they found was for her watching screen time. And it actually makes a lot of sense because screen time can be regulating. As we get more regulated, then we're able to access basic needs like eating. But what the boundary was is that she had to sit at the table and she had to wear headphones. So then everyone wasn't having to listen to it. But for this family, that worked. And for some of you, you might be going, oh gosh, I would never allow screen time at the table. That's because that's your family value, right? Probably, but it's also important to check in. Is that just a should in your family because that's what you've been taught? And so this is where it's a really mindful, intentional, proactive parenting approach. And I find that when we learn about PDA and low demand parenting, this is often that piece that is missing. And so what ends up happening is the kid is melting down and it's finally fine. You don't have to sit at the dinner table today. Those are going to feel like two completely different experiences in the moment.
Yeah. And and not to mention pressure from external forces, like your in-home sitter or the kid's grandparents, and then like staying consistent time after time. So for us, Griffin has different values than his parents regarding that. He's like, we do the screen time thing. And for us, it was low muscle tone that got us started on that. It was such hard work to eat that like Jack wasn't being able to eat very long. So we found if we distracted and he could eat longer. And we fed him too for way longer than we needed to. And we still do. Like I'll feed him the broccoli and I'll dip it in ketchup so that the broccoli gets in. Because to me, I always say health over whatever else the thing is, right? In this case, manners, I guess, or fine motor. But Griffin, on the rare occasion that he doesn't have eating practice, he's like, Jack, will you turn that thing off and talk to us? We're a family. And I'm like, yeah, you just tell. We have your 6 nights of the week.
Yeah, that's the default mode, right? And this is where parenting, if you want to parent different than how you were raised, it takes a lot of intentionality in order to do that. And it's also then admitting like sometimes you're going to make a mistake and like be like, ooh, that's not what I really meant.
Yeah. Well, and what I found, Taylor, maybe we can talk about this. So what I found is that once we have that relationship there, right? Like, okay, so to your point, the pediatrician saying, do you spend quality time? You know what? Sometimes quality time when we have to rebuild a relationship or when we have to rewrite the ship for a sensory reason or any other reason, Sometimes that quality time really seriously looks like joint attention. Jack moving Legos around and I'm moving Legos around, and I couldn't care less about the Legos, and it's torture for me. But that's what's important to him, and so I'm just doing it right alongside of them and, trying to be creative with Legos. Sometimes it's going out and take a bike ride or doing some PT exercises or something that's really functional. It all just kind of varies. But when we have reached the point that we've got the good relationship and we're in a good spot, there it can slowly increase demand. So eventually I was able to get him to feed himself with his fork until, we now say that you have to answer a certain number of questions at dinner. You can offer things, he never does, or you have to answer certain questions. And I know if I'm asking easy questions like, was so-and-so present at school today? Or if I'm saying, tell me one thing that you talked about in math. So let's talk about then how you start to increase demand, or if you ever start to increase demand. I would assume that, we all want to keep progressing as much as possible, right?
Yeah, I think this is a tricky balance because I think that, and how many times am I going to say this on on the podcast today? But I think there's a lot of nuance to this whole conversation. But yes, we can increase demands over time. And I think that sometimes we do this too quickly. And that is some of parental discomfort, or we could also talk about school staff discomfort. And I'll give an example of this in a moment of again, coming back to what we should be doing and what this should look like in terms of progressing and feeling that internalized pressure, or sometimes it's an externalized pressure to keep a kid on a certain timeline. And so while we can add these things back in, what it comes down to and what you're clearly articulating, Ashley, is the difference is that the relationship is at the center of it. And so you also probably, there's some days that you might realize he's more dysregulated and you just naturally are going to ask the simpler questions, right? Because just to get him engaged versus the other days, you might be having a great day and you can ask a little bit of harder questions. But that's where the relationship and that foundation of the relationship comes into play. And what the relationship also does is when you misstep, you push too far, you added a demand, you can go back and say, oh, that was a little much. I'm sorry. How are you feeling? Right. And check in or have that conversation or do that repair. And you have that relationship as the foundation. So it's easy to do. And so, yes, we can do that. But what I would say is a lot of times I find the autistic child is going to tell us when they're ready for more. They're going to actually start doing it themselves, as opposed and really allowing it to be child-led as opposed to it being adult-driven, I think is so important. And so a quick example of this, which so relevant to the IEP process, I see sometimes I have some schools that know nothing about PDA, want to learn nothing about PDA, want to learn nothing about neurodiversity affirming practices, and have, this is what our autistic learners get, and that's standard, and they think I'm crazy. I literally was in an IEP meeting last week that was just like this. But then I have other schools. I have some that are really just on it. But then I'd say there's a number of schools that are really trying to understand this. And it makes sense. It's such a mindset shift away from kind of those traditional behavioral approaches we often see, with autistic learners and what we see in their IEPs and all of that. But then the default kind of kicks back in. And so it's okay, a child's having a hard time accessing school. Getting to school, there's a lot of school avoidance, school refusal. And so I'll see them want to, work with the family on this, where it's okay, well, they can come in a little later or they can leave earlier. And they're doing that. And that is actually a really supportive strategy. But then they want this really rigid schedule or in this time, we're going to do this. And in this time, we're going to do this. And they start pushing too quickly. And then the child completely backslides and then isn't going to school at all. We have seen that time and time again. But what's interesting is when we build that relationship, we show this child, we believe you, school's really hard for you, and they're not getting anything out of school if they're there and dysregulated.
Right.
And
that's the whole problem. Right. Exactly. And the doctor in the relationship, you can't just dump them back into the same place.
Exactly. And that's the thing is what I find is sometimes then there is this natural progression that we can start adding time back in. And so I love the adults of it's not forever. It's just right now. And I think sometimes we worry that if we don't stick to this timeline that it means forever.
It's more efficient. Sometimes I say at meeting, you know how like your kid's in a sleep regression and you put them to sleep and the second their breathing pattern changes, normally you can leave, right? Like, see ya. Well, then they're in a little bit of a regression. They hit trouble for a couple of nights. You wait until they are drooling before you move. And then you like pop up on one arm and then you slowly release that arm. And then you like crawl to the end of their back because you've got to make sure that they don't freak out that you're not there. And that's how it is. Anytime you've got a blip on the radar, you've got to very deliberately start to fade support, or else you're going to start right back at where you were or even further back, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
And this
can I likely one more thing to what you just said? Because I mean, this is just so brilliant and I love it so much. And I'm thinking about 75 kids on my caseload too. I think parents, so with our guarantee partners, all of them, we probably do a bad job communicating those non-negotiables, shoulds, and yets. And we almost definitely do a bad job at communicating those to school, which would be extremely confusing for a child. If it's school refusal, and if parents say, I couldn't care less if they access school every day. My goal is that when they are at school, they successfully go to the bathroom or they successfully XYZ, who cares? But that's their goal. And school thinks the goal is to be at school. Then we're addressing a different goal. So, I'm thinking about, like a child that I have on my caseload that has a really hard time at practice, and the practice is part of the IEP, and it's really great. And the parent's goal for practice, for participation in this activity is all about the community. There's organic behavioral support, there's friends, there's wearing the uniform, there's showing up on game day, there's all of that stuff. The parent couldn't care less about the exercise. They're like, well, that would be great if we're a little more flexible, a little bit more strong. That's great. But I don't really care if they move an inch. I want them to have that logo on their chest. And that's because the parents know that's what the kid really likes. But then what happens is the kid successfully does the thing with a partner. Everything's great with a partner. And then the very next week, the coach is like, well, we don't need that partner. Have fun, Johnny. Go run the 100-meter dash. Go swim with Bree. And the parents were like, if they would just leave the partner with them all the time, then we said, wear the logo and we could show up and we can have the organic support and we can have everything we want. And we would get the activity, which doesn't hurt, but they fade the support too quickly. Maybe I tell them to communicate, like to really think about concretely your values around this by way of no's, shoulds, and yets. Maybe that would help.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I find is sometimes the battle with schools. But I talk about like, are we thinking about this in the same way? But I love how you articulated that, like, makes so much sense of like, yeah, like, are we speaking the same language? And I find a lot of times we're not speaking the same language. And so just very quickly, this family that I'm talking about that I went to an IEP meeting, the kid has clearly expressed that he wants to leave school early. He only can be at school for so long before it creates dysregulation. He's going home, he's melting down. School's saying, well, he's fine when he's here. And he is because he's masking, which is really, really common that we have this different experience at home versus school. And that's where sometimes schools can go, well, this seems like a parenting problem. And it's like, no, it's not. They're still dysregulated at school. Yeah, I know. It's like so frustrating. They're still dysregulated at school. It just doesn't look in that classic dysregulation profile. But it's also like, so school then is saying, well, no, we don't see a need for him to get out early. He needs to be here. he's missing access to these activities. And it's like, wait a minute, we're on two different pages. And well, I won't go into all the details. I have tried repeatedly to get us talking the same language. The school is not so invested in learning another language right now. And so that makes it tricky. But I find that if we can actually communicate this and understand it from this same lens, then these suggestions and these accommodations and IMPs and support services make so much more sense why we are asking for that. But we tend to fight at the like, but wait, I want this. No, I want this. And it's like, are we conceptualizing the kid in the same way? Or are we got it from two different perspectives?
And at some point, you have to move from advocacy to negotiation, right? Like at some point, you might have to say in that particular case, like, okay, we tried to collaborate on this, but I'm going to use some negotiation strategy. Like I would say, what's your goal? Give me one goal. Okay, our goal is that we're at school for 8 hours. What are you doing for that? Okay, here's the list of BS supports that we're doing. How's that working for you? And then you sit and you pause for 2 minutes and you just look at them, super calm. And you try that, and then you use this mirroring strategy where you like repeat and wait, and see if that helps. I mean, because sometimes you have to get them to understand that the parents here have hired you as an expert, and the parents have become expert by way of their work with you, and they've got solutions, but their solutions aren't being considered. Sometimes we've got to take them to the river and make them start sipping on the water. So
Yeah.
I mean, but I think this is so important. So the idea of PDA and the idea of requesting more autonomy and less demand is so important. I want to go back as we kind of wrap up here. I want to be respectful of your time, but as we wrap up, I think this was my last question, and I did not know that the autistic community had come up with a new acronym. So pervasive or persistent drive for autonomy. So I have oftentimes wondered if PDA was rooted in a function. Like if we talk about behavior, I realize it's coming from a dysregulated state, which could be arguably a sensory function if we go into the 4 functions of behavior that we talk about. So if that's true, like I'm curious about your thoughts on if this is coming from like a sensory standpoint, or if it's more like, would that be psychological? Like, hey, I deserve this, and this is like a part of my value set. I'm now starting to think it's more like psychological part of our value set.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that is true. And I often just kind of in practicality conceptualize it more related to anxiety. So in a diagnostic evaluation where we're diagnosing autism, when we're saying PDA is part of this, I'm diagnosing some sort of anxiety disorder. And only because I find that makes the most overlap with PDA, at least so far. But I often find there's a lot of other anxiety coming at play too, right? They're very clearly meeting diagnostic criteria for anxiety. And I think that can be helpful. And sometimes too, where, especially on the educational side, where if I can get, and I'll say this to parents, if we can get the school to understand this as autism plus anxiety, even if they don't understand PDA yet, I think that can be really, really helpful, because sometimes behaviors can present in this way as willful or defiant, but really this child is just really anxious and is trying to get this sense of control and this sense of safety to regulate their nervous system. And so that's really the lens that I like to, come at this from. We need to learn so much more about PDA. There's no question. And even the name, there's arguments, right? A lot of the autistic community likes that persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy. But then there's also this argument too of like, okay, like, yes, And are we moving away then from this idea that it's some sort of creating this impact that there's support needs, like it is not an official diagnosis, but like from the disability lens too, right? And this is the fight as a whole within the neurodiversity space is like, we need to recognize autism as a disability. We also want to empower, we should be listening to autistic adults. They have taught us so much about the disability, but where, sometimes we get a little stuck here. And I think the key is in understanding that PDA is really impairing. It really is impacting the child on a day-to-day basis that we need to provide the right supports and accommodations for, and that we need to understand, right, what is going on internally for that. And that is one of the primary drivers of why I have integrated talking about PDA into my practice, because it's about showing up for that child as a human and realizing that they need help, they need support, and that as adults, we can get that for them.
And it's invisible, like anxiety is invisible.
Right.
Don't
It's
how upset I am.
Yeah. Right.
Tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, that's good. Okay. I have downloaded more than once because I lost it. Your downloadable PDF on PDA. That's on your website, and I assume that you're talking about PDA a lot in your membership as well. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I can give the specific link for the guide, and that way they can download it and get access to it. And yes, I'm launching in the process of pre-launching, pre-selling membership. So founding members, and what this membership is going to be. It's a lot of what I do clinically, but with a clinical license, I am licensed in over 40 states to practice, but there's still sometimes limitations there that come into play. But it's really doing like a deep dive on the education. It's going to be a video library, a community for you to get support, and being able to share also resources with your team. So, for example, learning about PDA, like as I build this out, there's going to be videos of what PDA is. It's one thing. I wish this wasn't the case, but it is. So we need solutions. Is you going to school, sometimes you can be like, oh, I learned about this thing called PDA. And they're like, okay, whatever. They brush you off. But sometimes when someone like me comes in with a doctorate and I'm saying, hey, here's this thing, schools all of a sudden listen. And I wish it wasn't. They need to be listening to you as a parent. But I talk about, with the families I work with, like, let's use my doctorate degree. Let me be the squeaky voice for being heard of exactly what you'd say. But sometimes too, when it comes from a professional, they take it more seriously. And so it's like, I'll use that. I'll explain what it is, and then you'll be able to share the resources with your school. And maybe that will get you a little bit more traction. So
I agree.
really, yeah. So it's just drtaylorday.com/membership where you can learn more about that. And I can send you the link for the show notes as well.
Thank you, Taylor. You're the best.
Thank you so much.